Sergeant Daniel Carter stood straight, his posture firm as he observed the grand throne room of the Corvini Palace. The place was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Massive crystal pillars lined the walls, glowing softly in different shades of blue and purple. The ceiling was impossibly high, covered with golden patterns that reflected the light like tiny stars. It was a sight to behold, but Daniel had been in enough diplomatic missions to know that beauty often hid danger. The Corvini were an ancient and proud alien race. They had remained isolated from the rest of the galaxy for centuries, choosing to live by their own traditions. But now, with growing threats from hostile alien empires, they had no choice but to seek alliances. That was why Daniel's unit was sent here, to represent humanity in the first-ever peace negotiations with the Corvini Empire. Daniel wasn't a diplomat. He was a soldier, trained for battle and survival, not fancy meetings and royal gatherings. But as part of the United Earth Expeditionary Forces, he had been assigned as a security escort to ensure that nothing went wrong during the discussions. So far, things had been quiet, but he knew better than to relax. His sharp eyes scanned the room, noting the important figures present. Cain Vyrath, the ruler of the Corvini, sat upon his throne, his presence commanding respect. His long robes shimmered like liquid metal, and his piercing silver eyes missed nothing. Beside him stood his advisors and generals, all observing the human guests with cautious curiosity. But it wasn't the king or his officials that caught Daniel's attention. It was her. Princess Vylara, heir to the Corvini throne, stood slightly apart from the others, her gaze locked onto Daniel. She was stunning in an otherworldly way. Her skin was a soft silver blue, her emerald green eyes shining like precious jewels. Long strands of shimmering white hair cascaded down her back, making her look both regal and mysterious. She was dressed in an elegant robe, decorated with intricate golden embroidery. Everything about her radiated grace, power, and authority. But something was off. She wasn't paying attention to the discussions. She wasn't listening to the diplomats or even watching the human ambassador. No, she was staring at him. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. He had faced enemy soldiers, deadly alien creatures, and life-threatening situations, but the way this alien princess was looking at him made him strangely uneasy. She wasn't just curious. She wasn't just observing him like a stranger from another world. No, her gaze was hungry. At first, Daniel thought he was imagining it. But as the meeting continued, he caught her looking at him again and again. Her eyes followed his every move, her expression unreadable yet intense. What did she want? Was she studying him for some royal test? Was she evaluating his strength? Was she secretly planning something? Daniel had no idea, but he knew one thing for sure. He hadn't expected this. The diplomatic meeting lasted for hours, with discussions about trade, military cooperation, and cultural exchanges. But for Daniel, time passed strangely. Every time he looked up, he met the princess's gaze. Every time he shifted positions, he felt her eyes on him. When the meeting finally ended, the human delegation was invited to a grand banquet, a traditional feast to welcome them as honored guests. Daniel had no choice but to attend, though he wished he could be anywhere else. As he followed the human ambassador to the dining hall, he stole one last glance toward the princess. She was still watching him. And this time she smiled. A slow, knowing smile that sent a strange chill down his spine. Daniel didn't know why, but he had a feeling that this was only the beginning. Sergeant Daniel Carter walked through the grand dining hall of the Corvini Palace, feeling slightly out of place. The hall was massive, with tall crystal pillars glowing softly in different shades of blue and purple, just like the throne room. The long dining table stretched across the entire room, filled with strange, exotic foods from the Corvini world. Daniel took a deep breath and kept his posture firm. He had been trained for high-pressure situations, negotiations, tense standoffs, even battlefield survival. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. The reason? Princess Vylara. She was sitting across the table, but her piercing emerald green eyes were locked onto him. Again, Daniel tried to focus on the banquet. The human ambassador and Corvini officials were discussing trade agreements and military cooperation, but he could barely concentrate. Every time he moved, every time he shifted his gaze, the princess was there, watching him. And the strangest part, she looked hungry, but not in the way a person looks at a meal. It was different, more intense, almost predatory. Daniel clenched his jaw. Was this some kind of royal test? Was she trying to intimidate him, or was he just imagining things? The tension broke when the first course was served. The Corvini chefs placed large silver platters on the table, unveiling a variety of alien dishes. Some foods glowed softly, others had unusual textures, and a few emitted a faint steam that smelled strangely sweet. The human diplomats hesitated before carefully picking up utensils and trying the food. Daniel followed, grabbing what looked like a small round fruit. He bit into it, surprisingly juicy, slightly sour, but not bad. Princess Violara, however, seemed unimpressed with the feast. Daniel watched as she elegantly picked at her plate, trying small portions of different dishes. But with every bite, her expression remained the same, disappointed. One of the Corvini officials chuckled. "It appears our princess has not found a worthy meal yet." The others laughed softly, but Violara ignored them. Instead, she lifted her gaze and looked straight at Daniel. That same hungry stare. Daniel froze, unsure of what to do. He was just a soldier. He wasn't important. So why was the future queen of an alien empire looking at him like that? Before he could figure it out, Violara spoke. "Human." Daniel straightened, caught off guard. It was the first time she had addressed him directly. Her voice was smooth, but there was something in her tone. Something sharp, something curious. "Yes, Your Highness," he replied, keeping his voice respectful. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Tell me, does all human food smell this delicious?" Daniel blinked. That was not what he had expected. The entire table went silent. The human ambassador and the Corvini officials all turned to look at them, clearly surprised. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Well, I suppose it depends on the dish. Earth has many different types of food." Violara's eyes glowed with curiosity. "And you have tasted them all?" Daniel almost laughed at the idea. "Not all, but a lot." She leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. "Then tell me, Sergeant Carter, if I were to ask for a true human meal, one that would satisfy me, what would you serve?" Daniel was completely thrown off. This had to be some kind of trick, right? Or maybe she was just toying with him. He glanced around the table, expecting someone to interrupt the conversation, but no one did. The ambassador looked amused, and the Corvini nobles seemed just as interested as the princess. Daniel took a deep breath. "Well, Your Highness, it depends on what you like. Do you prefer something sweet, spicy, something warm and comforting, or something fresh and light?" Violara's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I do not know. I have never had human food before." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then I suppose you'd have to try it yourself." The princess's smile grew. "Then I want to." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You want to try human food?" She nodded. "Yes. Not what is served in your diplomatic meetings, not what is prepared by palace chefs. I want real human food, cooked by a human." Daniel's brain tried to catch up. "You mean, you want me to cook for you?" A quiet hush fell over the table. The Corvini nobles exchanged looks, surprised by the request. Even King Vyrath, who had remained silent through most of the meal, turned his sharp silver eyes toward his daughter. Violara, however, seemed entirely focused on Daniel. "Yes," she said simply. "That is exactly what I mean." Daniel had no idea how to respond. He was a soldier, not a chef. Sure, he could cook a decent meal, but making food for a royal alien princess, that was a completely different level. But there was something about the way she looked at him, Something serious. This wasn't just curiosity. This wasn't a joke. Violara wanted a meal only a human could make. Daniel exhaled slowly, then gave a small nod. "All right, Your Highness. If that's what you want, I'll cook for you." A spark of excitement flickered in her emerald eyes. "Good," she said softly. "Then we shall see if a human can truly satisfy my hunger." Daniel didn't know why, but something about the way she said that sent a shiver down his spine. And somehow he knew this was only the beginning. Sergeant Daniel Carter still couldn't believe what had just happened. He was a soldier, trained for combat and survival, yet somehow he had just agreed to cook a meal for an alien princess. As the banquet ended, the human diplomats were led back to their guest quarters in the palace. The halls were vast and shimmering, glowing with soft blue light from the floating crystal lanterns above. The atmosphere was peaceful, but Daniel's mind was anything but. Why had Princess Violara asked him to cook for her? She had access to the finest chefs in the Corvani Empire. The royal kitchens were filled with rare and expensive ingredients. Yet none of it had satisfied her. Instead, she wanted human food. And not just any human food. A meal cooked by him. It didn't make sense. Daniel sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. Maybe this was some kind of test. Or maybe the princess was just curious. Either way, he had no idea how he was going to pull this off. He barely had time to think when a palace guard approached him. The guard, a tall Corvani warrior with deep violet skin and golden armor, bowed slightly. "Sergeant Carter," he said in a formal tone, "the princess requests your presence in the royal gardens." Daniel blinked. "Right now?" "Yes, she wishes to discuss your cooking arrangements." Daniel wasn't sure whether to be nervous or amused. He had faced enemy soldiers, terrifying alien creatures, and high-risk missions, but nothing had prepared him for being personally summoned by an alien princess to talk about food. Still, orders were orders, even if they came from a royal alien princess. With a nod, he followed the guard through the winding palace halls, stepping out into the gardens. The royal gardens were unlike anything Daniel had ever seen before. Strange, glowing plants filled the space, their petals opening and closing as if they were breathing. Small streams of shimmering blue water flowed through the area, reflecting the twin moons above. The air was fresh, carrying a light, sweet scent, and standing in the center of it all was Princess Violara. She turned as he approached, her long silver blue gown catching the soft moonlight. Her emerald green eyes locked onto him, calm yet intense. "You came," she said softly. Daniel stopped a few steps away and gave a respectful nod. "Your Highness, you wanted to see me." Violara studied him for a moment before speaking. "Yes, I wanted to make sure you were taking my request seriously." Daniel hesitated before responding. "I'll be honest, Your Highness. I'm still trying to understand why you want me to cook for you. You have access to the best chefs in the galaxy." The princess gave a small, knowing smile. "And yet, none of them have satisfied my hunger." Daniel frowned. "Why? Is it the taste? The texture?" Violara's expression grew thoughtful. "It is something deeper than that. Every meal I have ever had, it has always felt empty, as if something was missing." She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "But when I watched you at the banquet, I realized something. Humans do not just eat food. They create it. They mix flavors, they experiment, they put their emotions into every dish. It is more than just survival. It is an art." Daniel was surprised. He had never thought about it that way before, but she wasn't wrong. Humans had always been passionate about food, turning it into something more than just a necessity. Violara's voice softened. "That is why I want a human meal. A real one. Not something made by palace chefs following instructions, but something made by you. A soldier, a traveler, a man who has experienced the galaxy." Daniel let out a slow breath. The way she spoke, it wasn't just curiosity. It was longing. She had spent her entire life eating luxurious meals, yet none of them had brought her joy. And somehow, she believed he could change that. Daniel finally nodded. "All right, Your Highness. I'll do it." Vylera's lips curved into a satisfied smile. "Good." She turned slightly, motioning toward a nearby palace servant. "I have already arranged for you to have access to the royal kitchen. You may use whatever ingredients you need." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You planned this ahead of time." The princess chuckled. "Of course. When I want something, I do not wait." Daniel sighed. Of course she didn't. The next morning, Daniel found himself standing in the royal kitchen, staring at an overwhelming variety of alien ingredients. The kitchen was massive, filled with advanced cooking equipment and strange foods he had never seen before. Some ingredients pulsed with light, some changed color when touched, and others had a strong, unfamiliar scent. The Corveni chefs, dressed in elegant dark robes, watched him curiously. They didn't say a word, but their expressions made it clear. They didn't believe he could do it. Daniel ignored them and focused on the task at hand. He needed to make something that was truly human, something flavorful, comforting, and real. But there was one big problem. He had no earth ingredients. He couldn't make a steak, a burger, or even a simple bowl of soup without the right spices and seasonings. Everything here was alien. Daniel exhaled slowly. All right. Adapt and overcome. He grabbed what looked like a root vegetable, slicing it open to find a soft, starchy interior. He found a protein source that resembled meat, but he had no idea how it would cook. He experimented with different spices, tasting tiny bits of everything. Some were sweet, some were spicy, and some were confusing. It was a challenge, but Daniel refused to fail. He wasn't just making food. He was proving that humans could turn anything into something incredible. As he worked, the Corveni chefs started to watch more closely. Their skeptical expressions shifted to curiosity. Even they could see it now. This human wasn't just cooking. He was creating something new. And somewhere in the palace, Princess Vylera waited, hungry for something she had never tasted before. Daniel Carter wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stood in the middle of the royal kitchen, surrounded by the finest Corveni ingredients. The kitchen staff watched him in silence, their expressions shifting from amusement to curiosity. At first, they had doubted him. After all, what could a human soldier possibly know about cooking? But now, they weren't so sure. The aroma filling the air was something they had never smelled before. Daniel had spent the last hour experimenting with the alien ingredients, carefully testing flavors, textures, and combinations. Some spices were fiery, others sweet. Some vegetables were crisp, while others melted in his hands like butter. He had no earth ingredients, but that didn't matter. Because cooking wasn't just about following recipes, it was about creativity. And if there was one thing humans were good at, it was adapting. Meanwhile, in the royal chamber, Princess Vylera stood near her balcony, gazing out at the twin moons in the sky. The night was peaceful, yet she felt restless. Her mind kept returning to him, the human soldier who had agreed to cook for her. She had no idea why she was so interested in him. Was it because he was different? Was it because she had seen something in him that others had missed? Vylera wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. She had never looked forward to a meal this much before. A soft knock at her door broke her thoughts. A servant stepped inside and bowed. "Your Highness, the human is ready." Vylera turned, a small smile forming on her lips. "Then let us see if he can truly satisfy my hunger." Back in the dining hall, Daniel stood beside a covered silver tray, waiting as the princess entered. The Corveni nobles and palace chefs had gathered to witness this moment. Even King Vyrath was present, though his expression remained unreadable. Vylera walked gracefully to her seat, her emerald eyes locking onto Daniel. "You are ready." The room went silent. Then, suddenly, applause. It started small, but then more and more Corveni nobles joined in, clapping in appreciation. Some looked stunned, others excited, but one thing was clear. They respected what had just happened. Daniel, standing there, couldn't believe it. He had done it. A new future begins. Later that night, as the celebration continued, Daniel stood on the balcony of the palace, looking up at the 7 glowing moons above. He had arrived on this planet as just another soldier. Now he was something more. Footsteps approached. He turned to see Vuilara, her emerald eyes glowing softly in the moonlight. "You did it," she said, standing beside him. Daniel chuckled. "Honestly, I'm still trying to process it." Vuilara smiled. "You have done more than just win a competition. You have changed the way my people see humans. You have shown them that your kind is capable of more than just war and diplomacy. You have shown them creativity, passion, and heart." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "I didn't come here expecting any of this." Vuilara turned to face him fully. Perhaps that is what makes it even more special. For a moment, they simply stood there, 2 people from completely different worlds, brought together by something as simple as food. Then, Vuilara smirked. "So, what will you do now, Master Chef Carter?" Daniel laughed. "Don't start calling me that." Vuilara tilted her head. "Why not? It suits you." Daniel sighed, looking back up at the stars. What would he do now? The answer was simple. He was going to keep cooking. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just following orders. For the first time, he was doing something he truly loved. And that was worth more than any title in the galaxy. The end. Daniel gave a firm nod. "Yes, Your Highness." She leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "And do you believe this meal will be satisfying?" Daniel smirked. "I guess we're about to find out." With that, he lifted the silver cover, revealing his creation. The nobles gasped softly. Even the chefs, who had spent their entire lives mastering Corvani cuisine, looked surprised. On the plate was a perfectly seared cut of alien meat, golden brown on the outside, tender on the inside. Beside it was a smooth, creamy mash made from a root vegetable, similar to Earth's potatoes. A rich, aromatic sauce was drizzled over the dish, adding a deep, mouth-watering fragrance. And on the side, there was a small serving of crispy, thinly sliced vegetables, carefully seasoned for balance. It was simple, yet elegant, a true human meal, created with alien ingredients. Vuilara's expression was unreadable as she picked up her utensil. The entire hall watched in silence as she took her first bite. She chewed slowly, her gaze flickering with something unreadable. Then, after a long pause, her eyes widened. The moment the flavors touched her tongue, she felt something she had never felt before. The meat was tender and rich, perfectly balanced by the smooth mash. The sauce added depth and warmth, while the crisp vegetables gave the perfect contrast. But it wasn't just the taste, it was the feeling behind it. There was passion in this meal. There was care. There was something missing from every meal she had ever eaten before. Vuilara slowly placed her utensil down, looking up at Daniel with something that almost resembled awe. The entire room waited, holding their breath. Even the king was watching closely. Finally, the princess spoke. "This," she paused, as if searching for the right word. Then, softly, she said, "is perfect." A quiet murmur spread through the nobles. The chefs exchanged glances, as if they couldn't believe what they had just heard. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "I'm glad you like it, Your Highness." Vuilara met his gaze, and for the first time since they met, her expression softened. "I do not just like it," she said. "This is the first time I have ever truly enjoyed a meal." The hall fell into silence. King Vyrath, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "You have done something remarkable, human." His deep voice echoed across the room. "You have created something no Corvani chef has ever accomplished." Daniel gave a small nod. "I only did what humans do best, Your Majesty. We take what we have and make the most of it. The king studied him for a long moment before nodding approvingly. Violara, however, wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes glimmering with something new. Interest. You are a soldier, she said, but you have the heart of a creator. I have never met a warrior like you before. Daniel shrugged. I guess humans are full of surprises. Violara tilted her head. Indeed. Then, much to everyone's shock, she did something completely unexpected. She picked up her plate and pushed it slightly toward him. Make me another. Daniel blinked. You want another one? Violara gave a small, mischievous smile. Yes, I have spent my entire life eating meals that left me empty. I will not let this be the only time I feel truly full. The room was stunned. No one had ever asked for seconds in a royal banquet before. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. All right, Your Highness, I'll make you another. As he turned back toward the kitchen, he couldn't help but smile. Maybe this wasn't what he expected when he came to the Corvani Empire. But somehow, he had won the appetite of a princess. And for a human soldier in an alien world, that was a victory like no other. Daniel Carter never thought that cooking would be the thing that made him famous in an alien empire. Yet here he was, standing in the royal kitchen, preparing another meal for Princess Violara. The Corvani chefs watched in stunned silence. Never in their lives had they seen someone, especially a human soldier, earn the favor of the princess so quickly. But what shocked them even more was how much she enjoyed his food. Princess Violara was known for her impossibly high standards. No meal had ever truly satisfied her before, but now she was asking for seconds, something unheard of in the royal palace. Daniel glanced over at her as she sat at the royal dining table, her eyes locked onto him. She was watching closely, as if studying his every move. He smirked to himself. No pressure, right? Taking a deep breath, he focused on the food. He had learned something important in the last few hours. Corvani ingredients could be turned into something amazing. It was all about understanding the flavors. This time, he decided to try something new. Instead of just remaking the same dish, he wanted to surprise her. A new creation. The kitchen filled with the rich aroma of sizzling meat, fresh herbs, and exotic spices. Daniel used a sweet, tangy fruit glaze over the protein, balancing it with a crispy golden crust. He paired it with a soft, buttery grain dish, adding a creamy texture that melted in the mouth. And for the final touch, a special sauce, made from a combination of alien spices that created a deep, smoky flavor. When he was done, he carefully plated the dish and stepped forward. Violara's emerald green eyes sparkled with curiosity. You changed the recipe. Daniel nodded. I thought you might want to try something different. The princess smiled slightly. You are not afraid to take risks, are you? Daniel shrugged. Where's the fun in playing it safe? Violara chuckled softly before picking up her utensil. The entire hall watched in silence as she took her first bite. Her expression changed immediately. First, there was surprise. Then, something deeper, pure enjoyment. She closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the taste. When she opened them again, they were filled with delight. This, she said slowly, is even better than the last one. The Corvani nobles exchanged shocked glances. The palace chefs, once skeptical, now looked at Daniel with something close to respect. King Vyrath, who had been watching silently, finally spoke. This is no accident. His voice was deep, full of authority. This human has a gift. Violara gave a small nod. Indeed. She turned back to Daniel, her expression thoughtful. Tell me, Sergeant Carter, how did you learn to cook like this? Daniel chuckled. Honestly, I just grew up in a family that loved food. My grandmother taught me how to cook when I was young. She always said, food isn't just about taste. It's about the feeling you put into it. Violara tilted her head slightly. The feeling. Daniel nodded. Yeah. Cooking isn't just about following a recipe. It's about making something special for the people you care about. The princess was silent for a moment, as if considering his words. Then, slowly, she smiled. "I see now," she said softly. "That is what has been missing from my meals all this time." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Viola sighed, looking down at her plate. "My entire life, I have been served the finest meals in the empire. Every dish was perfectly prepared. Every ingredient was rare and expensive. And yet, I never truly enjoyed any of it." She lifted her gaze back to him. "Now I understand why. My food was made by chefs who followed instructions, who focused only on perfection. But none of them cooked with passion. None of them cooked with the desire to bring joy." Daniel thought about that for a moment. He had never considered how empty a life of perfection could be. But it made sense. A meal wasn't just about how expensive or rare the ingredients were. It was about the effort, care, and love put into it. Viola set down her utensil and leaned forward slightly. "You have done something no one else has ever done before, Sergeant Carter." Daniel smirked. "What's that?" "You have made me truly enjoy a meal." A new proposal. The room was silent for a moment. Then, much to Daniel's surprise, Viola stood up. The Corveni nobles immediately straightened in their seats. The chefs looked at each other in confusion. Even King Vyrath raised an eyebrow. Daniel frowned slightly. Your Highness." Viola took a step toward him, her expression serious. "I have made a decision," she said. "From this moment forward, I want you to be my personal chef." Daniel's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" The entire hall erupted in whispers. The idea of a human soldier becoming the personal chef of the Corveni princess was unheard of. One of the palace chefs finally spoke. "Your Highness, with all due respect, he is not trained in our ways." Viola raised a hand, silencing him. "I do not care about tradition. I care about the food. And this human has proven himself more than worthy." She turned back to Daniel. "So, what do you say, Sergeant Carter?" Daniel hesitated. He had never expected this. He was a soldier, not a chef. His mission here was to ensure peace between humans and the Corvani, not to cook meals for royalty. And yet, a part of him was excited by the idea. This was an opportunity to do something no human had ever done before, to experience something entirely new. Plus, the way Viola looked at him, it wasn't just about the food anymore. There was something else in her gaze, something that made him wonder if this was about more than just cooking. After a long pause, Daniel took a deep breath and smirked. "Well, Your Highness," he said, crossing his arms, "if you're asking me to cook for you again, I guess I don't have a choice." Viola smiled. Good. The deal was sealed. And Daniel had just taken the first step into a completely unexpected adventure. Daniel Carter still couldn't believe what had just happened. Personal chef to the princess. That was not part of his mission. He was a soldier, a fighter, a man trained for survival in the harshest conditions. And yet here he was, standing in the grand dining hall of an alien palace, being offered a position no human had ever held before. The Corveni nobles were still whispering amongst themselves, clearly shocked by Princess Viola's decision. Some of the royal chefs looked insulted, while others stared at Daniel with a newfound respect, or maybe curiosity. Daniel glanced at the princess, who was still watching him with a confident expression, as if daring him to refuse. What was he supposed to do now? A soldier's dilemma. Daniel took a deep breath and crossed his arms. "Your Highness, I'm honored, really, but—" He hesitated. "I'm not a chef. I'm a soldier. I was sent here to ensure peaceful cooperation between humans and the Corvani, not to work in your kitchen." Viola didn't seem surprised by his hesitation. Instead, she stepped forward, her emerald green eyes locked onto his. "You said it yourself, Sergeant Carter. Humans adapt. You may not have come here as a chef, but you have shown more skill in one night than the best Corvini cooks have in years." Daniel scratched the back of his neck. "That's flattering, but—" The princess cut him off. "Let me ask you this. When was the last time you truly enjoyed something, Daniel Carter?" Daniel blinked. The way she said his name felt different this time, more personal. He thought about the question. He had spent years training, fighting, moving from one battlefield to the next. His life had been about duty, discipline, and survival. But tonight, as strange as it was, he had actually enjoyed cooking. He had enjoyed the challenge of creating something new, of seeing the princess's reaction when she tasted his food, of proving that humans could excel even in a completely alien environment. Viola must have noticed the change in his expression because she smiled slightly. "See, this is not just about duty. It is about finding joy in unexpected places." Daniel sighed. "All right, I'll admit, I liked cooking for you." Violera's smile grew. "Then consider my offer." Before Daniel could respond, another voice interrupted. A soldier should not waste his talents in a kitchen. The deep, commanding voice belonged to King Vyrath. The entire room fell silent as the king slowly stood from his throne, his powerful presence making everyone tense. Daniel turned to face him, standing tall. "With respect, Your Majesty, I wouldn't call this a waste of talent." Vyrath studied him carefully before speaking. "You have proven yourself resourceful, human. You have shown skill and creativity. But do not forget, you are here as an ambassador of your people. Your duty is to strengthen relations between our species." Daniel nodded. "And what better way to do that than through food? Cooking isn't just about eating. It's about connection. It's about understanding different cultures, different ways of life." He gestured to the princess. "Tonight, I did something no human has ever done before. I made a meal that a Corvini royal actually loved. If that isn't a step toward peace, I don't know what is." The room was completely still. Vyrath narrowed his eyes, considering Daniel's words. Then, to everyone's surprise, he let out a low chuckle. "You are bold, human. I see why my daughter finds you interesting." Daniel wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a warning. Vyrath's expression became serious again. "Very well. If Viola wishes for you to serve as her personal chef, I will not forbid it. But understand this. This is not just a simple position. You will be watched closely." Daniel met the king's gaze and nodded. "Understood, Your Majesty." Viola looked pleased. "Then it is settled." But before Daniel could relax, the princess added something unexpected. "You will not just be cooking for me," she said. "You will also accompany me to the grand feast of the 7 moons." The entire hall reacted in surprise. One of the nobles spoke up. "But Your Highness, the grand feast is reserved for the most distinguished members of the empire." Viola nodded. "Exactly. And I wish for Sergeant Carter to represent humanity there." Daniel frowned. "Hold on. What's the grand feast of the 7 moons?" Viola smiled. "It is the most prestigious banquet in the empire. The finest chefs from across the galaxy compete to serve their dishes to the High Council. Only the best are allowed to participate." Daniel blinked. "And you want me to cook there?" Viola nodded. "Yes. You have already impressed me. Now I want you to impress the entire empire." Daniel wasn't sure whether to be excited or completely terrified. A new challenge begins. Later that night, Daniel stood alone on the balcony of the royal palace, looking out at the twin moons shining in the sky. Everything had changed so quickly. This morning, he was just a soldier following orders. Now he was about to cook at the biggest event in the Corvini Empire. He heard soft footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Viola standing there, looking at him with that same curious expression. "You are thinking too much," she said. Daniel chuckled. "Can you blame me? I was supposed to be here as a soldier, and now I'm cooking for alien royalty." Viola stepped closer. "Perhaps this was always your true purpose here." Daniel gave her a skeptical look. "You believe in fate." Violara smirked. "No, I believe in potential, and I believe you have far more of it than you realize." Daniel sighed. "Well, let's just hope I don't burn the whole place down at the feast." Violara actually laughed at that, a rare, genuine laugh. "For some reason, I do not think that will happen." Daniel looked at her, realizing something. This wasn't just about cooking anymore. Something deeper was happening here. And whether he was ready or not, his journey in the Corveni Empire was only just beginning. The grand feast of the 7 moons was unlike anything Daniel Carter had ever seen before. The royal banquet hall was enormous, with high arched ceilings made of shimmering crystal. Thousands of glowing orbs floated in the air, casting a soft, golden light over the long, polished tables. The scent of exotic spices filled the air, mixing with the low hum of alien voices. The most powerful Corveni nobles, generals, and diplomats sat at their designated places, their elegant robes flowing like liquid silver. At the center of it all was King Vyrath and Princess Violara, seated on the highest platform, watching over the feast with regal authority. And standing in the massive open kitchen at the far end of the hall was Daniel Carter, a human soldier. A man who, just a few days ago, had never even dreamed of being in such a place. And yet here he was, about to cook for an entire empire. The pressure builds. Daniel took a deep breath, looking at the other chefs around him. They were the best in the galaxy, masters of their craft. Dressed in ceremonial uniforms, their movements precise and practiced. They handled alien ingredients like artists painting a masterpiece. And then there was him, a guy who had learned to cook from his grandmother. No formal training, no advanced techniques, just instincts, experience, and a whole lot of human determination. The head steward, a tall Corvani with a stern expression, stepped forward and raised his voice. "The grand feast will now begin. Each chef will present a dish to the high table. The judges will determine which creation is worthy of the empire." Daniel exhaled. No turning back now. Cooking against the best. The competition started immediately. The Corveni chefs moved with impressive speed and grace, slicing, mixing, and plating their dishes with the skill of professionals who had spent decades perfecting their craft. Daniel, however, had to do things his way. He had spent the last few days experimenting with Corveni ingredients, figuring out what worked and what didn't. Now he had to trust himself. He pulled out the marble blue meat of the Corveni Tal'Rek beast, something similar to beef, but with a richer, buttery texture. Instead of overcomplicating things, he kept it simple, a perfect sear, a balance of spices, and a glaze made from the sweet and tangy drill fruit. He paired it with a creamy grain dish, seasoned with herbs that gave off a smoky aroma. And for the final touch, a special sauce inspired by Earth's own cuisine, blending both human and Corveni flavors into something new. As the dish came together, the rich aroma filled the kitchen, making even the other chefs glance his way. Violara, watching from her seat, smiled slightly. She knew Daniel wasn't here just to compete. He was here to change everything. The moment of truth. One by one, the chefs presented their dishes. Each plate was more extravagant than the last, towering sculptures of food, rare ingredients, and flavors designed to impress. Then it was Daniel's turn. He stepped forward, placing his dish before the high table. There was silence. The Corveni nobles stared at it, confused. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't covered in gold flakes or shaped into an elaborate structure. It was just food. Simple, perfectly cooked, real. Vyrath, the king himself, picked up his utensil. The entire hall held its breath as he took his first bite. Then his eyes widened. He chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he took another bite. And another. The nobles murmured, watching their king eat more than just a single taste. That alone was a sign of approval. Violara, eager to confirm her own suspicions, took a bite as well. She closed her eyes, savoring the flavors. Then she smiled. "This," she said softly, looking at Daniel, "is the best meal I have ever had. A human victory." The entire hall erupted into whispers. A human, a soldier, had just outperformed the best chefs in the Corvani Empire. The head steward finally stepped forward, clearing his throat. "The results are clear. Sergeant Daniel Carter's dish has impressed the high table." He paused. "The winner of this year's grand feast is the human."